organizations, as they are recognized right now, are designed to kind of extract a lot from humans. And there's a lot of uncertainty about what would happen if it was done differently, right? If we were doing organizing with the assumption that people's needs can get met, right? That everybody's needs can get met. And I do think that that's true. I don't think that that's easy. I don't think that it happens tomorrow, but I want to make that assumption that people's needs can get met. And if we're going to organize differently with that assumption in mind, I don't know that we know what that looks like.
Hello and welcome to Stories Lived, Stories Told, a dialogue-driven podcast exploring how to create better social worlds through better communication. I'm Abbie, and today I invite you to join me in conversation with Kate Lockwood Harris as we take a communication perspective on a relational approach to disorganizing. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we embody curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. So, whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being for all of us. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner today, Kate Lockwood Harris. Kate is an associate professor of communication studies at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. She is also the author of Transforming Trauma, a Relational Approach to Disorganizing Systemic Violence, which will be available in print at the end of the month. She is also the author of a new public newsletter she's hosting on Substack called Communicate with Kate Lockwood Harris. One thing that I would have you keep in mind as you listen in on this conversation with Kate is to think about your own relationship to organizing and disorganizing. As you're going to hear Kate and I talk about, the uncertainty, the mystery, the chaos that can come with disorganizing can feel scary. So scary that it stops us from doing disorganizing, even when that's what is needed. So think about your own relationship to disorganizing and the story that you have around it as you listen in today. And let's begin the conversation with Kate. Hello, Kate. Thank you so much for joining me for the podcast today. I'm really looking forward to talking to you and learning from you.
Hey, Abbie, I'm really, really glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being up for this conversation. I've really been looking forward to talking with you as our relationship, and this episode as a product of that is such a beautiful testament to one of my favorite parts of the CMM theory, which is this idea of emergence. And so just to start us off by answering the question of how am I arriving today, that's very front of mind to me that we just happened to meet at a Taos Institute meet and greet. And that was very early days for me of becoming more involved with the events that the Taos Institute's doing, which they're just doing so many great things. And just kind of happened to, it felt like a very much, okay, I'm just going to put myself out there. I'm just going to be open to whatever emerges. And that's the point of those great meet and greets. And you happened to be there and this connection was sparked. And so I have enjoyed our correspondence since then. I've enjoyed reading what you've been posting on Substack. And so I think there's in some ways a lot of context for this conversation in terms of the turns that you and I have taken already. And there's also a lot of mystery in this conversation for me, as I'm not super intimately familiar with the work that you're doing around disorganizing systemic violence, which is just wording that I'm absolutely obsessed with. So I'm so looking forward to hearing more from you about what that process looks like. But I'm arriving with a lot of curiosity. I think I probably say that every episode. It's always true. But specifically, that's the context for the curiosity I'm arriving with. So if I can throw it to you now, Kate, how are you arriving?
Yeah, thanks, Abbie. And agreed, that meeting was really cool. I'm so glad that we connected in that space and have found, I think, some resonant commitments in terms of how to think about the world, how to create care and curiosity and embrace mystery, that are all principles of a communication perspective. So I'm so excited for this conversation too. I live in Minneapolis. I'm there today while we're recording. It's the middle of the afternoon. we're recording in August, but I think the episode is coming out in October. So it's kind of late summer. It's a beautiful sunny day here. The winters in Minnesota are really harsh,
I
but
bet.
summer
Yeah.
is totally worth it. And I have a sense that my relational world is really thriving right now.
Mm,
And there's just so much joy and playfulness and care in my relational world with friends and family and loved ones. And that's really sustaining me right now. I'm super grateful
mm,
for that. It's kind of a result of intentional effort to put energy into that. And it feels especially important right now because I think that we're living in a context with a lot of brutality, and what I see
yeah.
is a lot of absence of care for human beings, for other beings that are
Hmm.
more than
Hmm.
human for the planet. So I'm really grounding in that right now. And, um, I think that it's one space where I have a sense not only of how to push back on some of what's going on in the world, that it's
Hmm.
really devastating, but also, and I think that this is really important for me in terms of how I think about the world and for the conversation that we're going to have as we go on in this episode, I think it's a way to really create something with other people
Hmm.
through our relationships and to then issue an invitation to a version of the world that could be really compelling, right? Not
Hmm.
just against something, but really for and to something with a real clear sense of purpose and a sense of connection and care at the core. So I'm really grateful for that right now in my world.
Yeah, I already love that you're talking about care because that's something that I think is so important. And I believe to be something that's really vulnerable to care about something or someone. I have maybe referenced this before in a podcast, but I think back to my like middle school, childhood self, and you're just trying to fit in and you have the complex social world of school. And I remember maybe kind of picking up on the sense of like, oh, it's not very cool to care about that. It's more cool to be, oh, whatever, I don't care about anything. And so you kind of learn that sense. But I think I'm someone that I care deeply about a lot of things. I get very passionate, very excited. I'm very invested in my relationships too and the people in my life. And so I think this care is something that's really transformed for me as like, yes, it is a very vulnerable thing to do. To say I am invested in this. I would be sad if something happened to this thing. I want to tend to this thing and nurture this thing, whether it is a relationship or a interest or a passion or whatever. I just think that act of caring is beautiful and admittedly vulnerable in like this almost like risky way. And so I love what, I'm hoping we're going to talk about today and the shared context I know we have as communication scholar practitioners is that it's about helping people have some tools, some language so that they can do those more vulnerable relationship acts like care. So I'm already getting ahead of ourselves, but I love this conversation already. Kate, would you continue to introduce yourself to us as we've already gotten a glimpse into you and your life right now? But what is the story that, or stories, plural, there's many, of course, that you tell about yourself right now? Who are you? What do you want us to know about you as we go into this conversation?
Yeah, and I'll answer this question by weaving together a little bit of my personal and my professional lives.
Perfect.
So, professionally, I am an educator, a professor, a writer, a researcher. Right now, I work for the University of Minnesota, and I'm also a communication scholar. And I want to tell a little bit of the story about how I arrived at communication being such a core part
Please,
of
yeah.
my life, right? And it really is both in my personal and my professional lives. I think I was interested in communication before I knew it was a thing that you could study or a perspective you could have
Yeah.
on the world. I remember being a kid and being really interested and getting training, even in middle school, as a peer mediator, right? Being really
Mm,
interested in what's happening in conflict. How do people work
yeah.
through conflict? What are the possibilities for growing closeness through conflict?
Mm-hmm.
And I arrived at college thinking that I was going to double major in music and in math.
Mm,
I loved music, I loved math, and I thought that that would be the path. And I took my first math class in college and I didn't like it, which was actually kind of a loss because I really had
yeah.
enjoyed it before then.
Mm,
But that same semester, I was also required to take a communication class. And the teacher was so, so good, just such skilled pedagogy. And I hadn't known that the field existed. And suddenly I was very excited. I was like, oh, I can study and have a sense of the world that's really grounded in research and in theory
Hmm.
about how people connect, how they disconnect, how people coordinate around shared goals and shared values, how we figure out what meaning we want to attach to the world and what that means for how we act together in it. I'm still just as excited about it, I think, as
Yes,
I
yes.
was as a college student. That's something that I can spend my time doing is thinking and learning and being curious about that and helping people to understand how that kind of perspective can change how we show up. So, yeah, I ended up majoring in communication and music.
Hmm.
And those two paths have continued to be influential. The arts are really important to me. I don't do music professionally anymore, but I am a dancer and being embodied and building
Yes.
relationships with people through all the dance I do is partner dancing.
Hmm.
So it's another somebody dear to me recently said dancing like that is a microcosm of communication, right?
Mm. Yeah.
Where all kinds of things are happening in those brief moments where you're connecting with somebody to music and moving through the world together. So, yeah, I teach dance outside of my professional life as a professor and academic and scholar. And that really influences how I think about relationships and about communication is that kind of grounding in the arts as well as communication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great place to start. And I am really finding a lot of richness in metaphors that come from the world of music, the world of the arts. Just because I'm, lucky to be surrounded by people that are bringing that in. And there's a number of people I work with that are like jazz musicians and talk about that, or improv performers, improv comedy. And so bring in like really playful and relational elements from that. And so maybe that's something we can get into too, of more of the metaphors that you've been able to pull out of your experience with dance that relate to communication. But before we get to that, I want to dig a little deeper in your story, because the question that I always love to ask specifically people that have the communication background that come on my podcast is, kind of how did you first fall in love with communication? How did you get involved in the field? So you've answered that. But I'm also always curious, like, what keeps you so invested, excited, passionate about communication as a lens? Are there any experiences that you feel like you can point to, or general themes in your life that help you understand this is why I'm still so invested in this as a lens?
Mm, what a great question. Yeah, I think that the more that I know about communication, the more I realize that there's more to know.
Yes.
It
Yeah.
lets me be a
Hmm.
perpetual learner,
Yes. Yeah.
and it requires me to constantly be growing. And that's something in terms of an orientation of the world that I really embrace. Right.
Hmm.
So to really be in the midst of communication means that I need to attend to what's changing around me all the time.
Hmm.
How I'm changing, how the people around me are changing, how the connections are changing. And that's really exciting. Right. And I can bring to it this knowledge that I have through academics to understand, okay, like something went wrong there. What was it?
Hmm.
How can I shift that? But also, how can we as communities use those tools to build a version of the future that we want to see? Right. And probably the version of the future that we all want to see is not the same. And I think it's really important to honor those differences and to affirm those differences in the world we'd like to create. But it gives us a sense of, wow, there's a lot of possibility here, right? The
Hmm.
way that the world is right now doesn't have to be that way.
Yes.
And there's so many places where we can shape and influence together what happens next.
Hmm.
And for me, I think communication gives me a really clear sense that when things seem stuck, there's always some interaction around the corner that can shift it,
Hmm.
right? Even in the most intractable situations.
Hmm.
So it gives me a sense of possibility in the world, right? And a clear set of tools for okay, how do we with other people rely on that to make something
Hmm.
different?
Hmm.
You know?
Yeah, absolutely. The way that you're talking about communication resonates with me so much. Me being pretty firmly rooted in CMM, there's so many great theories and a lot of different perspectives on communication, but the way you're talking is very CMM-ish, is what I would say, about the coordinating, about the co-creating, about the possibilities. But I'm curious, I feel very much rooted in this like practical application side of it. That's what I'm more interested in. And right now in my life, I only have an undergraduate in interpersonal communication. I want to go get my master's. I want to go do more school. But right now I'm really working off an undergraduate degree, and and then my own personal experience and learning that way. Like you said, there's always so much to learn in academic spaces and outside of them. So I feel pretty firmly planted in being very curious about the practical applications of things and understanding how a CMM rooted communication perspective interacts with the practices and real people's real lives in the real world. I'm really curious your sense as a professor, as a researcher, as someone who's more enmeshed in the academia side of things. What is your sense of your view of communication in relationship to the larger field or discipline or other takes on communication that maybe don't emphasize this like co-creative aspect of it?
Yeah. First of all, I'm so excited to hear that you're thinking about studying more in
Yes.
communication. I was wondering about that before we talked today. And I think that's really exciting because you're connected to so many conversations that are happening through Taos and
Hmm.
design conversations and all of that. I think that that perspective is really needed in the academic part of the field.
Yes.
I'll say that because of my grounding in the arts and also because of my connection to activist communities,
Hmm.
not everything that I've learned about communication comes from the academy. And I think that that's been really
Yes. Yeah.
important
Great
because
point.
there's so many different ways to learn. And the academy offers a really important way to learn and to know, but it's not the only way.
Hmm.
And in fact, a lot of my understanding about how to engage violence in a way that shifts it has come through activist communities, particularly through being connected to folks who are grounded in the lineage that's called transformative justice.
Hmm.
And so I'm really curious about multiple ways to know the world.
Yes.
And that, right, what I know through my body through dancing is a
Hmm.
different way to know than what I know through reading journal articles. They're both really cool
Yes.
and they both
Yes.
have limitations.
Yeah.
But I like thinking across these different ways of knowing and these different sites of knowing and kind of noticing what they each, how they each let me move, both literally and
Hmm.
metaphorically in the
Hmm.
world.
Hmm.
Um, and in terms of some of what you were saying about practice and the practical side of things, I think for me, the theory knowledge that I have and the practice knowledge are really intertwined.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Like I have a hard time separating those,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
part of that's my artistic self, part of that's my teacher self, right? In terms of
Hmm.
being really committed to education. Um, Part of it's just how I think about the world, right? And some of it is also that most of my communication career has been focused on thinking about how does violence happen? Why does it happen? What's the relationship between violence and communication? How do we use communication as a tool that, while we recognize that it can exacerbate violence, how do we use it as a tool to
Hmm.
intervene to prevent
Hmm.
violence? That's an inherently practical set of questions.
Yes.
And
Yes.
a lot of it happens in, right, as you know so much from your own connection to interpersonal communication through relationships, through everyday interactions, right? That's kind of the building block of where these bigger systems come from.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That is, I would say I'm feel more firmly planted in the practical side of things because I'm not currently tied to, the academic world anyway. But what I'm most interested in and think is incredibly important is the bridge between the two, like you're saying, which I think cannot be, you really cannot have one without the other. I think people try, but I believe you cannot. And I'm so curious about bridging that gap because I think for me, very early on, it became a question of accessibility almost, where I'm sitting in a intro to interpersonal class saying, oh my gosh, why is this not the class that every student is required to take? How come I only get this
Here,
knowledge if
here.
I major in interpersonal communication, dedicate my whole academic career to it? And so I think for me, I was like, but more people need this. And so that's that bridge for me of like, okay, how do we get this in the hands of not just the people that are going to sit around and theorize and talk about it, the people that are 2 feet in the academic side, but how do we bridge these two ways of knowing, ways of being, exactly like you were talking about? So that feels like a great segue to take me into asking about your book, your upcoming book, Transforming Trauma. And I'm so curious to hear from you about how you are, creating a bridge between these two worlds in this book. But first, Can you give us kind of the synopsis, the one-liner, the overview of what is your book and your like short sell? And then tell us a little bit more about what it means to you.
Yeah. So the full title of the book is Transforming Trauma: A Relational Approach to Disorganizing Systemic Violence. And I think most folks know that individual humans can experience trauma and have responses to trauma,
Mhm, mhm.
right? That an individual person might freeze or flee or develop really rigid boundaries
Mhm.
or develop non-existent boundaries or become very perfectionistic or any kinds of things that can happen. I think that a lot of folks are familiar with what can happen to a person who experiences trauma.
Yeah.
But the premise of this book is that those same kind of responses to trauma that we can observe in individual people happen in organizations. So we might think about an entire workplace as being traumatized and exhibiting some of those same responses. We might think about, say, a religious group as exhibiting some of those, or an arts organization, a nonprofit, a small business, right? That those same kinds of things that happen to people happen to whole organizations.
Mhm.
And that if I also want to say that those responses are really wise, right? They're survival responses. The
Yes. Yeah.
freeze, the flee, the shutdown, any of these things are protective and help people to get through really horrific circumstances,
Mhm.
right? They're wise. It's wisdom in our bodies.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's also wise when organizations have those responses to trauma temporarily. But that if they don't eventually move and shift,
Mhm.
those responses get stuck in an organization, and a traumatized organization then becomes a traumatizing organization.
Mm.
So, right, it kind of participates in a cycle of violence and starts being a space where people can't thrive, they can't connect, right, where abuse, harassment, assault, bullying are likely to happen. So that's kind of the premise of the book. So I'm thinking about how do we notice those things in organizations, and then what do we do to shift them?
Okay. I already, yeah, loving all of this. And I'm just, kind of cheesy saying, but I think one that has truth to it that comes to mind is the idea of hurt people hurt people. So I'm imagining there's a parallel you're saying of hurt organizations hurt people, hurt other organizations, hurt,
100%.
whatever.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm curious about to just keep going on what you're saying of, okay, can you give us a little bit of a taste of what is in your book in terms of that naming, that recognizing, which I see as being so important and, a really primary and main function of communication. I say a lot, if you don't have language to talk about the things you experience, then you don't talk about the things you experience. And so I think that's like the first key of communication is empowering and giving us tools to name, recognize, acknowledge things that are going on. And then again, like another bridge of, okay, naming to then action. What action do you take? So what more could you tell us about recognizing trauma in organizations? And maybe you could share an example of that because I'm not in your world and I'm not having an obvious one come to mind as far as how can an organization be traumatized and how might that, become part of the lifeblood of an organization.
I like to use as an example, I think most folks are familiar with the some organizations will use bureaucracy to organize themselves to run.
Okay.
So there are really rigid roles, rules. Departments are separate and have specific functions.
Hmm. Hmm.
And one reading of this kind of way of organizing could be in its extreme versions when the rules are super rigid, when the
Hmm.
roles are super rigid, when things are very, very separate as a response to trauma. Right? The bureaucracy became the predominant way of running organizations around the 1950s in the US. And so if we think about what was happening historically, it's kind of in
Mm.
the wake of World War II. So it makes a lot of sense in that particular historical context to have really clearly defined roles that
Hmm.
people can't step out of, to have really clear rules that are kind of hard to change, right? That
Yes.
take time to change. And so we could think about bureaucracy, that part of it, as a response to what was going on in World War II and the extreme violence of World War II to kind of protect against that,
Mhm.
right? A wise response in
Mhm.
terms of
Mhm.
how the organization is running. But then, if it's really extreme, right, we can see disconnection among people in the organizations, right? Department A doesn't know what Department B
Yeah.
is doing. And maybe even Department A and Department B, because they understand that their distinctness and separateness lets them continue to exist, stop connecting with each other, start
Mhm.
competing, right? And so you see these organizations can become really siloed and disconnected, and
Mhm.
then innovation drops, capacity to change drops, capacity to respond to what's going on in the context
Mhm.
drops. So this might be an example of how trauma could get built into an organization
Yeah.
and then create a set of conditions where people end up not being able to thrive, not being able to do good work, creativity goes down,
Mhm.
right? A sense of satisfaction with work goes down. So that's kind of one concrete example. There are many others, right? We could think about how evaluation processes work in organizations. We could also think about the conditions where literal physical violence is likely to happen in organizations. But I think that that example kind of gets at not just what's happening for individual people in an organization, but how the entire organization
Mhm.
is running, right?
Mhm.
Um, yeah, we could also see an organization kind of close in on itself in the wake of violence, get suspicious about taking advice from
Mhm.
people outside of its borders, right? To kind of like close in and keep things secret. And that might be really useful in some contexts, but taken to an extreme, it's
Mhm.
going to disconnect that organization from what it needs to know in order to continue to learn and be reflexive as an organization.
Mhm. Mhm. Something that I've come to believe is really important in life communication relationships is kind of agility or flexibility or go with the flow ability. And I say that as someone who does not naturally possess those things. I prefer control. I love a good structure. I love a good ritual, a routine, and recognize that there's, places for that in our lives, and have been on my own journey of learning about what are the practices I can cultivate so that I can respond well in moments, so I can improvise. Like I said, that's kind of a um, lens that I kind of overlay over the communication perspective to make sense of emergence and mystery in the world and how we handle that in relationships and at the level you're talking about now in organizations. And so I find myself really curious about how change actually happens, because I think so many people share the kind of lens that I have slash had. I'm hoping to have less of that. Things are what they are, and maybe not feeling personally empowered or not feeling like you want things to change because the idea of going through the process of something changing feels so much more overwhelming than just sticking with a bad way of being. So you use this language of disorganizing, which I love because that immediately conjures images to me of like chaos, being disorganized. Ugh, it sounds like a bad thing when it feels chaotic, when it feels out of control, but you're talking about it in a more systemic way, which is, well, what if we intentionally, mindfully, in a practice way, using all these tools, how can we disorganize when we need to, like you said, recognizing that and then disorganizing. So your phrase is disorganizing systemic violence, and so I'm curious about kind of just disorganizing as idea, but also that as the concept of kind of continuing what you were just talking about. What does that look like and what does it mean in organizations?
Yeah. So this term disorganizing, I'm drawing from a community of scholars in a subfield called organizational communication. And as a field, organizational communication assumes that organizations are a process. And so we're actually
Hmm.
often using the word organizing as a verb to emphasize that, to say,
Yeah.
okay, an organization is not a thing, it's not set and
Right.
done.
Right.
But because we're communicating and because communication is the thing that makes an organization, it's always in process. So
Hmm.
we'll talk about organizing. And then alongside that, a number of scholars who I'm connected to will talk about how the thing that's known as organization, that gets recognized as organization, kind of depends on There being nothing disordered, there being nothing disorganized.
Mm.
And so organizations tend to be these spaces where we're like, oh, feelings, emotions, that's not part of the organization,
Right.
right? Sexuality, definitely not part of the organization. Being embodied, not part of the
Yeah, right,
organization. This
right.
is the space of rationality, of efficiency, of
Mm.
productivity, of tight control.
Mm.
And that's actually, I think, not the reality, but it's a
Yeah.
fantasy of how we'd like organizations to work. And so, along with a number of other folks, I'm drawing on this term disorganizing to say, hey, actually, part of organizing involves disorganizing. These two are always going
Mhm.
together. And in order to have organizations that thrive, we have to be able to see the two as intertwined.
Mhm.
So, part of what I think that idea of organization that's so if organization means efficiency, rationality, productivity, if that's the only thing that it
Right.
means,
Yeah.
that's so aligned with systemic violence, right?
Yeah.
That's aligned with exploiting labor. It's aligned with extracting resources without care for where they've come from, who they belong to, how
Mhm.
to take care of them, right? It's that idea of organization is systemic violence.
Yes.
And so disorganizing that by understanding that organizing and disorganizing go together is, I think, a piece of how we transform the intense violence that's really built into so many systems that we've got.
Yeah.
And, practically, I think that I was participating in that process as I was writing this book
Mm.
and bumping up against it so many times and just the challenge and the vulnerability of that disorganizing process.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
just as like one brief example, I finished writing a draft of the fourth chapter of the book, which is actually the one that I wrote first.
Yeah.
And, and then, I had gotten feedback from reviewers and had a lot of people read it. And then I realized that I was finishing writing the book in such a different place than where I started that the ending of that chapter didn't feel right anymore.
Mm.
It was designed to kind of pack an emotional punch at the end of the chapter. And I was like, you know what? This is not what I want to do anymore. I want to be playing,
Mhm.
not punching.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I ended up writing a completely new ending for that chapter, right? Kind of after the book was done.
Mhm.
And it felt so risky at that point, right? I kind of liken it to a game of Jenga. Have you played Jenga?
Yeah, yeah.
So, I mean, if there's anybody listening who hasn't played Jenga, it's right, these wooden blocks that create a tower. And the game is you move one block at a time and place it atop the tower and try to keep the tower standing. And if it falls, you've lost the game.
Yep.
And I felt like changing the book at that point was kind of like pulling a piece out of the Jenga tower that was going to let the whole thing
Right.
collapse.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, but actually, I think that this needs to happen, right? I think that,
Yeah, it's
yeah,
risky. You wanna make
yes,
moves, you wanna feel like you can change, but it's getting increasingly wobbly as you do that.
exactly. And so I actually write about this in the new ending to that chapter because I think it's such an example of something you were pointing to before, that disorganizing sounds like chaos, or it can
Mhm.
sound like chaos. It can feel like things are not going to go in a way that's very predictable for those of us who are
Mhm.
comforted by predictability and
Right.
routine, which I share that. And is there a way to understand that as a type of play? That,
Yeah.
okay, the tower falls down and
Mhm.
we've got these pieces, we can build a new tower, and maybe it's different from the other one.
Mhm.
Right? Maybe it's really uncomfortable in the midst of that process. But maybe there's some fun that can come from that,
Mhm.
right? Maybe there's an opportunity to rest that comes when the tower falls down,
Mhm.
right? Maybe there's a chance to dream up an even cooler tower, you know? And so I think that, I'm using an example from kind of my process of writing the book, but I think that that process kind of mapped onto organizations and onto relationships is a piece of how things shift,
Mhm.
right? And yeah, there's risk in it for sure, right? You don't know what might come
Yeah.
next. There's a lot of uncertainty, and, or to use the CMM language, there's a lot of mystery,
Yeah.
a lot of unpredictability. And there are also ways to, as groups, kind of prepare for that and decide,
Mhm.
okay, you know what? Something really cool is going to happen next. We don't know what, but gosh, something cool is going to happen.
Hmm. Yeah, and this feels distinctly different to me than like trying to put a silver lining on something. And saying
Yeah.
like, and I'm thinking too of, I've learned a lot from Chris Wells and Emma Nicholson, who do the Positive Disintegration podcast. And I see them as kind of a parallel for the CMM Institute in terms of they are doing a lot of work in the world to teach about the theory of positive disintegration. And I love that language so much that, yes, a disintegration, which again sounds like a negative word, a undoing, something that's in and of itself chaotic. But this whole theory that they work with is about that it can be positive, that it can be meaningful and spur growth and all these things that you're saying for organizations. This theory is about for individuals. And so I'm curious to hear how you understand that restorying of moments of disorganization or things that feel like they could be bad, but we decide to reframe because we're adopting this different lens that you're talking about of disorganizing as part of organizing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll use another example from the book, and again, kind of about the writing process as a kind of metaphor for what happens
Mm-hmm.
relationally. But I was working on a different chapter. This is the fifth chapter that is about kind of what we were talking about at the beginning about how sometimes organizations can get really rigid about
Mm-hmm.
sorting what's in and what's out.
Sure.
And as I was writing that chapter, this was during 2021, so the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic was alive. It's in the wake of uprisings in Minneapolis, where people are really confronting and addressing in a really vigorous way the pandemic of racism that's been going on for hundreds of years in the US and connected to most of the globe. And I kept on, as I was writing this chapter about organizations being rigid about what was in and what was out, getting stuck on grief.
Mm-hmm.
I had lost so many people during a short period of time, right? 8 people who were close to me. That's not my normal life. I think that that is normal life for some people, but for me, that was really challenging to be processing that kind of grief, to have it be happening in a context where we couldn't gather. And as I was writing, I kept on being like, okay, like I got to set this grief aside. Like, this is not part of this chapter. It's not part of what this is about.
Mm-hmm.
And it kept on being present. And I noticed as I kept engaging with that, that as I was writing the chapter, I was doing the kind of organizing that I was trying to disorganize,
Right, right. Yeah.
right? That they're kind of intertwined, right? So I was deciding, okay, in order for this chapter to be organized, I have to keep the grief out of it. It's got to be over there,
Mm-hmm.
not in here. And there's so many parallels to broader social systems with that kind of move, right? Like racism operates that way, particularly kind of the whiteness version of racism of like, okay, the bad stuff is over there, not in here,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's a signature move of whiteness. And we kind of do that around gender, around ability, right? Okay, the the bad stuff is just somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
So I ended up eventually being like, oh, actually, grief is a super huge part of this chapter, right? Like, we
Yeah, yeah.
cannot think about trauma without understanding that anytime there's some kind of trauma, whether it's a person's trauma, a collective's trauma, an organization's trauma, a cultural trauma, that there's loss associated with that.
Mm-hmm.
And that if loss doesn't get grieved, it ends up showing up in all kinds of other ways that are maybe not as useful. And so that was tough in terms of writing the book to kind of welcome grief
Mm-hmm.
into an organized argument that I thought I'd already figured out, you know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And and we see that on a broader scale with organizations, right? Like if the thing that runs an organization is like we were talking about productivity, efficiency, all of those kind of things, rationality, we don't give people time to rest or to grieve
Mm-hmm.
or to be sick
Yeah. Yes.
or to need to regroup.
Yeah.
We decide that that's the thing that happens over there outside of the organization, that that's disorganization.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the key to shifting these things is kind of welcoming these things as part of each other.
Mm-hmm.
There's this really useful term from a scholar, Karen Barad, who talks about the exteriority within.
Mm.
And Right. I like that term because it refuses a separation of this thing from
Yeah.
that thing completely. Right.
Yes.
It doesn't erase difference,
Hmm.
but it makes it so that there can't be such a rigid line between one thing over here and the other thing over here. Right. I can't neatly separate out grief from rigid boundaries in this particular chapter. Right. And
Yes.
so organizations need to not do that either.
Hmm. Yeah. And this is bringing me to language that I know you use in your book and other work as this way of disorganizing systemic violence, that being there's probably many ways to disorganize, quote unquote, but you're advocating for a relational approach. And so I'm curious to hear how you're defining a relational approach. But what assumptions I'm making, or in what I'm hearing you say, is that it's the exact opposite of everything you've just said about how we've traditionally defined organizing, which is incredibly impersonal. To say you don't bring your full self into work. We don't have flexible policies about days off. There's a lot of, I know countries do it differently, but thinking about the context we share in the United States, that like, oh my God, maternity leave is so short. People have so few sick days or paid time off. And it's like, that is such a narrow way of organizing that to me is innately not relational. So what, in opposition to that, what is the relational approach and how can organizations use it?
Yeah. So a relational approach assumes that first, the world is interdependent, right?
Yes.
That we're not
Yes.
made of individual islands,
Hmm.
that people are fundamentally interconnected, that people and land are fundamentally interconnected, that people and more than human animals are fundamentally interconnected, right? And so we want to pay attention to the flows and connections, not the individual things. It's kind
Hmm.
of a
Hmm.
relational
Hmm.
perspective broadly. But then it also means that if a policy in an organization really isn't working and there's just not momentum to change the policy,
Hmm.
that there's still a way to shift what's going on by changing the everyday interaction. And vice versa, if you're in that organization, and I think everybody has been at some point in their life if they've got some work experience, where the relationships are just really bad,
Yeah.
you know, that there's still a chance to change what's going on through policy, through practice, through process. So it kind of gives us more places to shift what's going on.
Hmm.
And I also want to add, you were talking about kind of maternity leave and some of the policies that make being a human really hard in some parts of the
Yes.
world. And it's super interesting because, for example, research on play and rest shows that people are actually more productive and efficient
Hmm.
if they have rest and time to play and space away. And yet that's not it's not the logic we apply
Yeah.
in a lot of organizations. Right? So when organizations are talking about efficiency, about like demanding high productivity from their workers, I don't think it's actually about that. I think it's about
Yes.
trauma and about violence.
Yes, because for me, that brings up the question of, if we know that, if there is research about rest and play being so important, what is keeping us from disorganizing and reorganizing with that knowledge?
Yeah, and I think it's scary, right? Like
Yeah.
I think it's a cultural fear. Like I was saying that when I decided to rewrite that chapter, it's like making a really risky move in Jenga, and we don't know
Hmm.
what'll happen next.
Do you feel like it's fear of just disorganizing in and of itself, or is it fear of a different, like we talked about, different ways of knowing? Is it a fear of that? I don't know. What do you mean by fear?
Yeah, I think that people and organizations and cultures can respond to the unknown
Hmm.
in a lot of different ways. And like we were saying at the beginning of this conversation, it's actually pretty hard to be curious and to care about things because there's vulnerability
Yeah.
involved, right? I
Yes.
think I really appreciated how you articulated that. And when we step into the kind of uncertainty that disorganizing brings, because it's different from how things are organized right now, sometimes in the face of uncertainty, we want to cling to certainty instead.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think it's fear of the unknown.
Hmm.
Sometimes because of this trauma framework, I think that it's often fear that the violence that either we've experienced or enacted will come again.
Mm,
And those are like different valences to that kind of fear, right? Like
yeah.
fear that that violence that we've experienced will come again um, lands differently in organizational bodies
Hmm.
than fear that the violence that we've enacted will come again or be enacted upon us. Right? And I think
Mm,
that when folks are in positions of power, that often is the fear that gets bumped up against. And for me, I think that that might be the more salient fear around what's happening in organizations, right? Because organizations, as they are recognized right now, are designed to kind of extract a lot from humans.
yes.
And
Yeah.
there's a lot of uncertainty about what would happen if it was done differently, right? If we were doing organizing with the assumption that people's needs can get met, right?
Hmm.
That everybody's needs can get met. And I
Hmm.
do think that that's true. I don't think that that's easy. I don't think that it
Yes.
happens
Yeah.
tomorrow, but I want to make that assumption that people's needs can get met. And if we're going to organize differently with that assumption in mind, I don't know that we know what that looks like.
Hmm.
Right? The way that some people have met their needs is at the expense of others. That's kind of how
Yeah.
organization got built,
Hmm.
through all kinds of systems of violence, including colonialism and misogyny and queer and transphobia. And right, like all of that is intertwined together
Hmm.
for me in terms of how I understand what organization is right now, which doesn't mean that there aren't other organizations that might not get recognized,
Hmm.
but that's a big piece of it. And so letting go of that can be really scary if you don't know something else.
Yeah, yeah, that makes so much sense and brings up for me language of that I remember originally hearing from Brene Brown talking about in a relational way, but I think has been used in a lot of ways a scarcity mindset versus an abundance mindset. And so I think probably another, thing I would add to the list of defining how we currently organize, quote unquote, is operating from a scarcity mindset that says I need to take from you so that I can have what I need rather than abundance, which like you said is not easy, but I think it's a reality if we could disorganize and reorganize to let it be true. The other thing I'm thinking about is this language we've touched on a couple of times of different ways of knowing or moving from one way of knowing to another, integrating. But I think something interesting between the ways of knowing is the not knowing. And that feels really important for your work of really not intervening is maybe not a word you would use, but recognizing, acknowledging, like you said, when you were in a trauma response. And I think that it's a lot easier for people, which makes sense that, they've had time to process. But I think we hear a lot of people's stories about trauma after the fact when they've made sense of it and put a kind of nice bow on it where they could make a meaning out of it that they feel like they could present to other people. I think we are starving for more stories from like the messy middle of trauma, of pain, of conflict, because people are so used to hearing the stories of, well, it will work out in the end, or this is how it turned out. But what's it like to be in that moment between the ways of knowing and really grounded in that not knowing? So I'm curious what you think about the not knowing, the vulnerability of the uncertainty, like you were just talking about when it comes to navigating trauma in an organization.
Yeah, I really appreciate this question. And I think that a lot of the work that's been done on trauma talks about how it's unspeakable
Mm,
and it's unsayable, that how could we possibly know trauma if it can't be spoken, if there's
mm,
not language for it, if it's the thing that exists outside of our meaning making systems. And I I think that when that's how organizations think about trauma, that okay, we got to have super concrete evidence of exactly what happened in order to do anything,
mm-hmm.
right? That's a very fast path to doing nothing.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Existing in that space in between knowing and not knowing is, I think, part of transforming trauma, part of disorganizing. And I'll use two different stories to kind of to illustrate that. So one is uh, I was at a dinner with some loved ones at their home, and we're just sitting down to eat, and their dogs in the backyard just are making so much noise. Like, we can't imagine what is happening. They're just making so much noise, and we go out and we find that there's a dead possum,
Oh.
and we're just so upset. We're angry with the dogs. We're, like, trying to reconcile, "Okay, we love these dogs. They're so cute and cuddly, and also they're murderers right now."
Mm,
And how do we reconcile that? These beings who we love, who we keep in our homes, have both of these capacities.
mm,
And, we had trouble with that for a while, and we're kind of like, well, we can't get the dogs back inside. They're so focused on this possum that we
mm.
can't do anything. Right. We kind of got stuck in that. And eventually one of my loved ones was like, wait a second. Possums play dead. Is it possible that this possum hasn't actually been murdered, but might be playing dead in order to survive the attack of these dogs? And we're like, okay, like, we don't actually know.
Mhm.
We don't know. It's possible that our dogs murdered this possum. It's possible that our dogs did not. We don't know. So my loved one got a bucket and put it over the possum so that we could distract the dogs, bring the dogs back inside.
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
know, we go back out. Looks like the possum is still dead. We're caught in a cycle of grief, still like trying to reconcile our relationship to these dogs who have, whether the possum is dead or not, caused harm. And, the story ends well. It turns out the possum was actually playing dead,
Yeah,
had not
wow,
been killed,
wow.
and eventually went away. But right during that period of time, we're in that space of being in between knowing and not knowing,
Yeah.
and the contradictions and complexities that can draw up,
Mhm.
right? And I think, like, I use this example of the dogs because I think it's easier for us to hold for a cute fuzzy creature, both the delight and joy that that creature can bring, and also the harm and hurt that that creature can cause, right? It's
Mm.
easier to hold those two at the same time. But when we apply that to humans, I think it gets harder, right? We
Mm.
like to split and
Yes.
be certain in our knowledge of this person is either a good person or a bad person.
Right.
And the reality of being human is that we're in between that knowing and not knowing. We're in between doing things that are really wonderful and contributing to the world and doing things that cause harm. And that's a condition of being human. And if we can't recognize that capacity in ourselves and other people, we end up creating all kinds of problems.
Yep, yep.
Um, and, it's just a second story to get at some of this again about being in between knowing and not knowing is if we insist that the people around us let us know them, that can be really harmful too.
Mm,
So
mm.
in the dance world, I mentioned I do partner dancing, and there's really cool stuff that can happen in that space. So if I am dancing with somebody and I notice that they have a lot of tension in one of their shoulders, it really disrupts the creative process and the relating. If I'm like, hey, what happened? Like, why is your shoulder so tight?
Yeah.
It violates the etiquette for this particular social space.
Sure,
But
sure.
more than that, maybe they don't want to say, maybe it's none of my business. But what I can do to keep the relationship going in that dance is mirror it in my own body if I have the capacity and willingness to do that.
Mm, mm.
Right. I can also tense my shoulder in the same way that theirs is tensed. And it makes it so that we can move more effectively together and have a
Yeah,
better
wow.
relationship and connect better. And then after I've done that for a while, I can then release the tension in my own shoulder. And a lot of times, what'll happen is that the person I'm dancing with will release the tension in their shoulder too.
Wow.
Sometimes they're aware of it, sometimes they're not.
Mhm.
And then as I'm dancing, I learn that my partners are doing the same thing for me. Right. So we become mirrors for each other.
Yeah.
And instead of getting obsessed with like, what happened? I need to know what happened. We end up actually focusing on the relationship instead. And that's where things can shift, right? Because we connect with people without having to know and while embracing not knowing,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
I know something. I know that there's tension in this person's body. I don't know why. And I'm going to exist in that space in between. But then if I have the capacity and willingness, be a mirror. And then that's how things can shift through relating.
Mhm. Yeah, those are, I think, both really helpful stories and just bringing me to this, not conclusion maybe, but reflection on that. So much of what we've talked about today is about being in between these spaces, whether it's theory and practice, knowing, not knowing, organized, disorganized, this kind of betweenness. can feel like the chaos, can feel like the uncertainty, can feel like the exact thing we are unequipped for if we don't have this improvisational, agile, relational, co-creative understanding of communication. So keeping all that in mind, one more betweenness that I want to talk about is a way I think of maybe naming a larger theme of what's going on in your book or what you're actually doing in your book, which is using these like interpersonal concepts on an organizational level. Or I know you talking about it's about these everyday interactions, because what is an organization if not just a bunch of people? So what's the betweenness, or what's the relationship for you between connecting the everyday interactions and also functioning on the level of recognizing the broader social dynamics and how those shape each other?
Yeah, and I think this is one of the things that I appreciate most about a communication perspective, but also particularly an organizational communication perspective, is
Yeah.
that it gives me tools for understanding how those are connected, right?
Yeah.
How everyday interaction is inextricably bound up with what's happening at an organizational level and is also bound up with what's happening at a bigger cultural level.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So we use in my field this term discourse, and we'll distinguish between a lowercase d discourse and an uppercase D
Okay.
discourse. So discourse, the lowercase, the little d one, is kind of what we're doing right now, right? Talking to each other. And big D, capital D discourse is all the cultural scaffolding that influences what we're doing right now. So
Mm-hmm.
maybe discourses of ideas about productivity, meanings around uh, gender, right? What it means to be patriotic. Like all of these things are circulating
Mm-hmm.
and they influence each other, right? So maybe we could imagine ourselves in a field somewhere, and the sky we can see it's blue, the grass is growing, and I decide to walk from one corner of the field diagonally across it to the other side. So this is a moment of discourse, right? In this metaphor, right? I'm saying something as I walk across the field. And maybe sometime later, somebody else comes along and can tell that the grass is a little bit bent there. They're like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I can walk across the same way. And then maybe multiple people keep walking across. And eventually there's a path through this field that wasn't there before, right? Maybe it's actually dirt now. The grass has stopped growing there. And there's this way for people to walk through. Maybe eventually a community decides, you know what, this path is used so much, we're going to put cobblestones down here.
Mm-hmm.
So, right, as I'm saying things in my everyday life, as I'm engaging in little d discourse, every time I'm creating a path, we like notice what each other says. And then that builds up to a bigger system of meaning that then becomes more solid, that becomes a piece of the cultural meaning
Mm-hmm.
that operates. So that's pretty cool, I think, you know? And of course, it works the other way too, right? In the US, a lot of people who live in the suburbs. I live in a very urban downtown space, but I hear stories of what happens in the
Yes.
suburbs where folks will get invisible fences for their dogs. And right, the dog learns by bumping up against that fence that it can't go a particular place, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
the
Right.
influence of big D discourse
I see.
on what people can say. But, you know, maybe one day all the neighborhood dogs get together and dig underneath that fence and it changes, you
Yeah,
know?
right, right.
But that those large cultural systems influence what we say, how we relate, how we connect to in that way. And I think having an understanding that, okay, what I say, if I decide to say, hey, y'all, instead of hey, guys, that shifts the path through the field,
Hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And it creates something different. Not everybody's going to want that,
Right, right.
but for me, if I address a group of people and say, hey, y'all, it opens up a different set of conversations about what's normal, what's expected, right? Who's valued in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not going to topple centuries of a system of gender and
Right,
race,
right, right.
but it does something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's so meaningful to be able to develop that skill to kind of zoom out and zoom in and kind of work and make sense on both of these levels of seeing the minutia of our interactions, of our relationships as being meaningful. And hopeful my hope is not in a kind of debilitating way where it's like, oh my gosh, every single thing I do and say matters so much so I can't do and say anything. I hope that people feel more empowered and relaxed about that. I hope to be like, yes, everything matters so much. And also we have tools like repair. We have tools like disorganizing, like all of these kind of like cyclical things, the messy middle of the betweenness of it all is a part of it rather than like something to be avoided or a signal that something was bad or wrong. It was in terms of like being a closed door rather than an open door to, walk through and be curious about. So I just, think that that's so valuable. And thinking about kind of wrapping up our conversation with the language that I love to use of better social worlds, and thinking about that as a goal, that all of us getting a little better, a little more equipped, a little more empowered around disorganizing as a practice feels like certainly part of making a better social world, and specifically a very relevant part of it right now, very timely one, because I think a lot of people are seeing what maybe was previously invisible to them before and is becoming invisible, maybe slowly, about the systems that we do live under, the ways we organize and how they are oppressive. And I think people are starting to really see a need to disorganize, but have not yet quite like made that leap to, okay, we need to disorganize, but how do we disorganize? So I think your book is so timely for us right now. So thank you for having that wonderful timeliness. As we wrap up, Kate, what else do you want to say? What do you want to leave people with? Is there something I haven't asked yet that we haven't talked about? Is there a story that's burning in your mind that you'd love to share with people? The floor is yours. What would you like to end this conversation on today?
Well, I want to say thank you so much for this conversation. I have noticed so many points of resonance and so many ideas that have come to mind as we've been talking, and connections I hadn't thought of before. And I think that's a testament to how work like this is always done through
Yes.
interaction and through relationship.
Yeah.
So I want to just voice appreciation for you and the work you're doing, and for the CMM Institute, for the space and the worlds you all are creating. And because I think about everything as kind of constantly in process, as in flow, I would like to issue an invitation for folks to stay connected and to get in touch if they'd like. One thing that I'm doing that's um, very much aligned with the moment when you said earlier that why doesn't everybody get to take a communication class? I was
Yes.
just like,
Yes.
yes, 100%. The world would be different. But one of the things that I'm doing right now is writing public essays about communication skills, about how they play out in our relationships. And that's been super exciting. I think that, figuring out how to make these ideas more accessible has been actually super fun.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
so I'm writing monthly essays. It's called Communicate, COMMUNIKATE. So like my name at the end of the word communicate. And you can find that katelockwoodharris.substack.com. So if you'd like to stay in touch and continue the conversation and kind of read more, engage more about the ideas we've been talking about today, that's one place to do it. I'm also offering coaching to folks who are wanting to grow their communication skills for thriving relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So you could reach out again through that newsletter to reach me there. And I'm starting to do consulting with groups who are trying to build thriving organizations to kind of do some of this work of
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
disorganizing. So yeah, I'd love to be in touch with folks if something resonates or you want to hear more about things. That's the way to get in touch with me, is through that katelockwoodharris.substack.com, through those public essays. It's a great way to be in touch. So
Yeah. Yeah. My hope is always that the conversations we have on the podcast feel like the start of a larger conversation, or one piece of a larger conversation. And so I'm appreciative of that invitation for you to continue to engage people in that way. And, one final thing that's coming to mind as you're talking, and I'm thinking of this conversation as being a piece of a larger whole, is that even as we name certain parts of our stories as being in one way of knowing, I think it's true that every knowing is its own kind of not knowing. Like there's so many different ways to tell the stories about how we're learning, like you said today, like my hope for the podcast is truly the collective learning and that's, I think, just the best way for learning to happen is when we create something together. And so I do believe that has happened today too. I'm glad that you feel the same. So Kate, just thanks so much for your time and your perspective, and people can be on the lookout for your book and we can all keep learning together. And it's so wonderful. So thanks for everything, Kate.
Thanks so much, Abbie. I really appreciate it.
Okay, that is all for today's episode. But remember, the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. There are so many ways to stay in dialogue. First, you're always welcome to reach out to me to share your reflections, questions, and ideas. There are also a number of online spaces where you can comment, including the Stories Lived, Stories Told Instagram and the CMM Institute Substack. Links to all these places to connect are in the show notes. If you want to stay up to date, a couple things you can do are follow the show wherever you listen, leave a rating and review, share this episode with someone you want to invite into the conversation, and subscribe to the CMM Institute Substack to get every episode right in your inbox. Stories Lived, Stories Told is an initiative of the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. You can learn more about the CMM Institute and our other initiatives, including our other podcast, Cosmo Parenting, and all our free Cosmo activities, as well as Cosmopolis 2045. There's also the CMM Institute Fellowship and the CMM Institute Press. We have so many great resources that we are so excited to share. Again, links to all of that can be found in the show notes. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.